Today is Friday, October 7th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today I'd like to talk about why modern educational standards are so low, why they're so low, why Catholic schools are offering the same study program we find in a modern public school, why homeschools are dumbed down to grade level basics, kids working out of workbooks. Why have educational standards fallen so low? And I'm not criticizing public schools or secular private schools. This is true of Christian schools and Christian homeschools just as much as it's true of any secular school. So don't pick on public schools. Everything you say about the public schools is true about homeschools and private schools. Educational standards are low across the board, not just in secular schools. And what I'd like to talk about is why they're so low. And here's the reason why. I'm going to make this very simple. The reason why educational standards are so low today is because parents who live undisciplined lives and do not seek wisdom themselves have set themselves up as obstacles to the children whose education they're responsible for. Parents are the obstacles for the academic achievement of their children because their undisciplined life and their lack of interest in studies is an obstacle for their children. I'd like to share some details of a few of my students to give you an example of this and make this clear. This afternoon, I just finished my Friday tutoring session with a 12-year-old boy, one of my students who lives out in California. This 12-year-old boy comes to his tutoring meeting with me online in a shirt and tie, and both of his parents attend his tutoring meetings through Zoom. Every single week, I meet with this 12-year-old boy in a shirt and tie and both of his parents in a tutoring session on Zoom. His father is at work and will join us in the Zoom meeting room. His mother is at home in a different part of the house. She joins us sitting at a table in the Zoom meeting room, and the boy comes to the meeting prepared to study with me for an hour. And we could easily go 2 hours if time allowed for it. This boy is 12 years old. Both of his parents attend every single tutoring session that he participates in. They support him constantly in his studies. They communicate with me during the tutoring sessions. They ask me questions. They listen as I explain things to their son. Both parents participating in every tutoring session. And that's not an exaggeration. Every tutoring session. Both parents are present with their son, interested in his studies, asking their own questions, helping their children study, providing for their children to study, and showing their children how important those studies are by participating in them, by being present for the tutoring meetings. That's the commitment of parents. The boy comes to our weekly meetings with a full week of studies completed. If you don't know how I do tutoring work with students, I manage a planner for each of my students that I tutor, and I give them a list of tasks to complete every week across all of their subjects. They then work on those tasks throughout the week, and they make notes on this planner to let me know how they're doing. When I meet with this 12-year-old boy, he has every single task completed that I've listed on his planner with notes, commenting, this is done, I got this score on this test, I submitted this assignment. His planner is complete from top to bottom. Every task given for the week is done. This boy started out back in June with a few courses because his family just learned about the academy. He started in June and he had 4 or 5 basic courses, which I'd recommend for a 12-year-old student. After a month or so, he had easily proven that he could handle those basic courses, and he requested more courses. The 12-year-old boy asked for permission to study classical Greek, to study classical reasoning, to study classical ethics, that is, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He asked for permission to add these courses to his list of studies. He's 12 years old. Every Friday, this boy comes to our tutoring session with all of his work done, happy, ready to discuss his studies with a list of questions that he's prepared for me throughout the week. Today, he came to our meeting with 11 questions. 11 questions that he needed help with. 3 or 4 of them pertained to quizzes and assignments that he had taken during the week, and the other 7 questions had to do with the content of the lessons that he was studying. To give you an idea of the questions, this 12-year-old boy is working through Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This boy's working through our classical reasoning course, studying Porphyry's Introduction. One of his questions today was, he was studying the tree of Porphyry, which is introduced in one of the early lessons of classical reasoning, and he noticed that in the diagram of the tree of Porphyry, there were some words, because this is an old image, there were some words written in script that he couldn't read, and he wanted to know what those words were. They were the words divisive and constitutive. He noticed those words and couldn't figure out what they were in an image that he's not even required to understand. It's just presented to show the concept of the tree of Porphyry, which I explain in the lesson. He couldn't figure out what those Latin cursive words were, and he wanted to ask during our tutoring session. So we talked about what the constitutive differences are in the tree of Porphyry. This is a 12-year-old boy. Another one of his questions was from his Baltimore Catechism course. As he was studying about angels, he wanted to know if angels have free will. This was another of his questions, whether angels have free will. He asked me, do angels have free will, or did they only have it in the beginning when they chose to follow God or to disobey God? Do angels have free will? And so I took time to show him the Summa Theologica and show him the place where St. Thomas Aquinas answers that exact question. I showed him in question 59, Article 3 of the Summa, where St. Thomas answers the question whether angels have free will. And so we read through that answer together, talked about it, and he was very happy to see that that question was answered by St. Thomas in the Summa Theologica. And we got to talk about how the studies that he's doing right now in grammar, getting started with reasoning, are preparing him so that in the future he can study the Summa Theologica and understand it. Those are the kinds of questions that he brings to our tutoring meetings. He doesn't have to bring these questions. These questions aren't necessary for him to complete lessons in the academy, he's studying the lessons, and he's talking about the lessons with his parents and with his 2 older sisters who are also studying. Their family is studying the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy and Catholic theology. They're studying it together. They're talking about it. They're discussing the questions. They're discovering the questions that they'd like to have answered. And they come to the meetings with me with all of their questions in a list, ready to discuss these things. The family, not the individual student by himself, the whole family is eager to study and understand scholastic philosophy and the classical liberal arts, Catholic theology, and so on. The whole family is interested, and the children know that even mom and dad are interested. Dad will sign into the meeting at the scheduled time because he wants to understand the things that they were talking about in their family and the questions that they prepared for the tutoring session. The family is committed to learning. I work with a number of students in similar circumstances. That's one family. As I said, they have a few kids in the program that I work with, and mom and dad are present at every single tutoring session. Every single tutoring session. They're all present. On one of the days, I met with one of the daughters for an hour, worked through all of her things with her, and then moved to her older sister for another hour. During the hour that I worked with her older sister, the younger sister, who was finished with her tutoring session, went into the other room and sat with mom and listened to the second tutoring session. This family has gotten more work done in the academy in 3 months than many of the families enrolled in the academy have done in 10 years. And it's because they actually desire to understand these things, and they commit to this learning as a priority in their family life, and they're thriving in these studies. They don't have one brilliant, gifted child. This is all of their school-age children doing the same quality of work with the same interest, with the same diligence, with the same consistency week after week after week. As I said, they've accomplished more in just a few months than many academy families have in years and years. And the formula for their success is very simple. It's sincere interest among the parents for classical Catholic learning. The parents put the money on the table to provide their children the help that they need. The parents are present and engaged with the studies. And the children have an incredible amount of support and encouragement for their studies. That's one family. There are a number of families I work with who are similar. There's another family I'm working with who enrolled a 5-year-old son to work directly with me in private tutoring. A 5-year-old son. He's already studying Aesop's fables. He's already reading Latin. Already started at 5 years old. He comes to our weekly meeting, 5 years old. His mother starts the meeting with me, and she gives me a quick overview of what they've been able to get done during the week. She explains what verses of the Latin reading lessons he's been able to work on. She talks about which of the fables of Aesop they've been able to read together and discuss. And then after she gives me the introduction, she gets her son all set up for the meeting, and he and I discuss his studies for an hour. This boy comes to the meetings with the verses of the Gospel of John in Latin memorized, able to read them and pronounce them correctly, and he knows the translation of every word in the Latin text. He comes with a knowledge of Aesop's fables from his week of studies with his mother. And when I ask him to tell me the fable, give me a paraphrase of the fable, the boy repeats the fable almost with the exact words of the text in the lesson. He knows it thoroughly. This boy is 5 years old, and he's already reading Latin and able to read and understand the fables. There are teenage students who can't understand the moral lesson of the fables. This boy comes understanding the moral of the fable, and he's able to think of examples of how the fable applies to his life, even though he's 5 years old. So his examples almost always include stories related to time on the playground. But it's because of the commitment of his mother, working with him throughout the week, providing for him to receive this attention and help even from a young age. And we see the fruits of it. It's no magic formula. It's not some kind of mystical spiritual blessing upon an individual child. It's work. It's reasonable commitment to the pursuit of real goals. And I see this in, as I said, a number of families. There are some families, they don't listen to any advice. They have their own plans, their own goals. And year by year, they accomplish very little. There are other families who come in, ask questions, take advice, put that advice into practice, and make rapid progress. The formula is not a mystery. So why are the standards in schools so low? It's not because the different schools have different children. It's not that I just am blessed to have a handful of extraordinarily gifted students. These kids aren't necessarily gifted. They work. They follow instructions. They listen to advice. They ask questions. They complete tasks on a list. They work every day. I can go on the website and see students who are at work, and the kids who get their work done, they're working at 9 o'clock at night on a Friday. They're working. They follow instructions. They get task lists done. They're supported by their parents. They're interested. They're asking questions. That's the formula for this high academic achievement. The reason why schools can't have, well, I can talk about a few different problems, but the number one reason why modern students cannot achieve these things is because their parents are in the way. Their parents can talk about how, oh, well, I didn't have this opportunity to have this kind of education when I was a kid. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Your childhood education is 20 years in the past. It has nothing to do with whether or not you're studying these things today. I grew up in a family where neither of my parents went to college. They were both manual workers. My father was an electrician. My mother worked in an accounting office. There was no education in my family. I never read a book growing up as a kid. We watched sports and news and television. We played sports. We worked. We did mechanical things. I was raised in a family that was not academic. When I turned 18, 19 years old, I realized that I needed to get to work academically, and I got to work academically. It didn't matter that my parents weren't academic. It started when I was 18 years old, And by the time I was 20, 27, 28, I was at the top of my class in college. My adult life had nothing to do with my childhood life. And therefore this perpetual self-excusing where we're not studying the scriptures, we're not studying philosophy, we're not focused on learning, we're not praying the Liturgy of the Hours, for example. Nothing is consistent. We're not studying, we're not thinking, we're not discussing the subjects we should be discussing as families. And we blame this on the fact that we weren't sent to some classical school when we were 12 years old. That has nothing to do with what we're doing today or this weekend or next week or next month. That's got nothing to do with what parents are doing now. So for most children, when parents do have ambitious goals for their education, what the children see are parents telling them what they should do, telling them how valuable these things are, telling them how important this learning is, and then not pursuing it themselves. How persuasive do you think that message is? How persuasive do you think it is for a child to hear dad tell him how important Catholic theology studies or classical philosophy studies are, and then watch his father turn around and go and sit down and put the television on? No one's going to fall for this fake message, this fake talk about Catholic learning. No one's going to fall for it. None of the kids are going to think that this is serious, because the parents don't seek it themselves. The parents come up with excuses. Oh, well, when I was... That's got nothing to do with what you're doing right now. That's the number one obstacle. That's the reason why educational standards are so low. The parents are not living the life that they're telling their children to live. The parents are not studying the things they're telling the children to study. They're not seeking the things they're telling the children to seek. And the children don't believe them that these things are really important. If parents do try to take the next step and actually get serious about this, they find that there's a lot of sacrifice necessary. Financial sacrifice, personal, physical sacrifice, sacrifice of time, sacrifice of attention. There's a lot of sacrifice. The parents have to learn that in order for their children to live a disciplined life and achieve great things, the parents have to first live a disciplined life and lead their children in the achievement of these great things. Once the parents learn that, once that reality sets in, that the parents can't simply throw a couple $100 at a goal that they talk about and then just leave it on autopilot for the children to take care of themselves, or they can't just plop a kid down in front of a computer for a so-called tutoring session when the kid hasn't studied all week because the family's been running all over the place. As soon as they realize that for this child to achieve these goals, his parents are going to have to show a real interest in them. The interest begins to stop in the parents. As soon as they realize that they have to lead their children rather than just push their children, the low standards set in. It's hard work to achieve noble things. To fulfill noble goals requires noble work. Extraordinary goals require extraordinary sacrifice. And this is the chief reason why the educational standards in modern schools is so low. It's not because of the schools, it's because of the parents. The parents set the bar. Usually the children who come and work with me and accomplish the greatest things have parents who work and understand the importance of these studies. The parents understand the need for classical liberal arts studies, for Catholic theology studies, for classical philosophy understanding. The parents understand it. They're seeking it themselves. And what they do is they come into the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and they seek it with their children. And this is one of the differences, I think, between our program and others. I study and work to be an expert in the subjects that I offer to teach students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I work to be an expert, not just to be someone who can pretend to be an expert when he's working with 12-year-olds, but I study and work to be an expert who can work even with professional adults, with highly educated adults. There's one man currently studying with me who's arranged private tutoring with me, who is a doctor, a British doctor. And he is meeting with me for tutoring meetings, and in these tutoring meetings we discuss classical Greek. He's learning to read classical Greek, working together. We're studying Aristotle's reasoning, working through the categories of Aristotle together. We talk about other subjects as well. And then we get into some professional discussions where we talk about how these ideas we're studying in philosophy apply to our professions. I can work with a middle-aged professional man interested in studying the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy, and I can work with a 5-year-old student doing the same. And I invite parents to not merely enroll their children, but to enroll themselves and to study these things and not make excuses. Oh, well, I didn't have the opportunity. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you didn't have the opportunity. You have the opportunity right now. Your childhood opportunities have nothing to do with your present activities. You can study them right now. And this is why in the Academy we welcome adult students. Our family plan, for example, provides for everyone to study, not just the children, but also the parents. I'm happy to work with adults. I can provide support and help for adult students who want to study these things. I'm not a teacher's manual teacher who has to stick to the script and has to work with young children because I know I won't get any challenging, mature questions from an adult. As I said, I study and work to be a teacher who can teach these subjects to young children and who can teach these subjects to professional adults. And we welcome adults to study these things. So there's no excuse for why children can't study the classical liberal arts as they watch their parents do the same. And of course, I understand parents have work to do, parents are busy. I understand all that. But there's no excuse for the parents' neglect of the studies that they're trying to tell their children are important. And this is what ultimately causes the low standards in modern education. Now, there were high standards in medieval education, but it was because all of the people who weren't interested in studies were just left out in the fields. They weren't dragged into schools, and their children were left out in the fields with them. If the parents weren't interested in learning, their children joined them in the fields to labor. Occasionally a child would come out of that crowd, but it was very rare. A good example might be Don Bosco, for example. But most of the time, the parents who didn't care about learning, who didn't give attention to the study of philosophy and theology, they worked with their hands and their children worked with them. The advent of the public school system and compulsory education laws, which forbid children to work, forced all children into school, which isn't even natural. And where the parents are not intellectual and the parents are not concerned with learning, the children are never interested either. And children with parents who don't support them in school and who aren't engaged in learning, those children always struggle in school. And the children who thrive in the schools are almost always children whose parents are engaged in their studies, if not diligently studying themselves. The formula is not a mystery. The problem, as I said, is that in modern schools, we basically have all of the children of peasants in the schools. The peasants today don't look like the peasants of the 1400s. The peasants today are wearing shirts and ties. The peasants today are walking around with smartphones and laptops and business suits. The peasants today have computers and libraries and books and all these things. But what makes them peasants is where their attention is given. Their minds are on the same things that the minds of the peasants were back in medieval times, but they look very different because we've modernized and civilized the peasantry in modern society. Our peasants in America look like noblemen. Our peasants look like members of a royal court. They have the appearance of nobility, but they've got the mind and interest of peasants. And peasant children don't learn. Peasant children can't study because they see the things that their parents are interested in, and their parents drag them into those things with them, preventing them from being able to look to those subjects which are the concern of true learning. And this is why the standards are so low. The father who cannot think beyond getting a job and making money wants the school to prepare his son to get a job and make money. The father who's interested in the football game is interested in his son being on the football team. These people have the mind of peasants, and their children, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their conditions in life, materially speaking, their children are peasant children, thinking about, talking about, working for the things that were the concerns of peasants in medieval times. And yet all of these children rather than being in fields and shops as the peasant children were, they're all in schools. And there's this appearance of being scholars, though they're really just peasants in school uniforms. This is the real cause of low standards in modern schools. And yet the same reality exists today that existed back then. There's a small number of children whose parents are committed to learning, just as parents in medieval times were committed to learning. A good example would be St. Thomas More. It didn't matter what was going on in society. St. Thomas More was focused on philosophy and literature and learning. He was focused on his professional career in law and understood the importance of these subjects in his life's work, and he pursued them constantly. He himself was studying. His friends were other classical scholars, men like Desiderius Erasmus. These were his friends. These were the men that he had dinner with and talked with and wrote letters to. His children were raised in that intellectual culture, watching as their father constantly sought wisdom for the sake of his own spiritual life as an individual, and also for the sake of his country as a public servant. His children saw this, and he provided that his children would have the education that he himself worked for. The intellectuals raised children who were intellectuals, and the peasants raised children who lived with the thoughts and concerns of peasants. And the same thing is true today, though these classes look very different than they did then. And this is why standards are so low. The children are expected to pursue these studies on their own, or a tutor who is provided to work for an hour with a child is supposed to provide a whole life's worth of culture in an hour of meeting time. It's just not a realistic expectation. It's like the saying, they have wine taste and a beer pocketbook. The expectation simply doesn't match the effort. And this is the problem with modern education, and kids see right through it. The kids see right through it. The only way that children can be raised to take study and learning seriously is to have parents who take study and learning seriously. Not parents who take the children's studies seriously, which is just hypocrisy, but parents who take their own study and learning seriously. When the parents study, when the parents seek wisdom, the parents then seek high standards for the education of their children. It's no secret that many parents can't afford to teach their own children. They have to work. Education is not their profession. And so they're interested in using the wealth that they gain from their profession to provide their children with tutors that they actually need and who can help them. But the parents expect those tutors to provide their children with the quality of education that they themselves seek through their own studies, that they themselves need and use in their own careers. That's what they seek from tutors. And most of the people involved in tutoring are peasants themselves. Most of the teachers are mere peasants themselves. They are working for a paycheck. They're doing minimum required work so that they can obtain a paycheck. Even though they are employed by schools, they live like peasants. They are merely doing a task for the needs of their bodies, for the pleasures of their senses. Our society has simply institutionalized schooling so that peasants can work as school teachers. The parents get frustrated because they know that their children need more. How can this woman or this man teach my children to write when they themselves don't write? How can my children learn this art from this teacher when this teacher hasn't mastered this art and has no intention of ever mastering this art, but simply goes through the teacher's manual and checks the boxes day by day throughout the school year? We can't have a peasant school system. We can't have peasants serving as teachers, or we're just going to raise another generation of peasants. And this is exactly what modern schools do. Because the modern job market is office-based, the peasants have to be prepared and apprenticed for the office. And that's what the modern schools and universities have become. They're not places where people go seeking wisdom to engage with men who seek wisdom. They're simply apprentice shops where the modern peasants receive their apprenticeship and prepare for their modern labors. There are dresses, there are shirts and ties, there are dress shoes, briefcases and laptops, cubicles and fluorescent lighting, computers and photocopiers, but it's just peasantry. And children are being raised as peasants, being apprenticed in the peasantry of the modern office. Catholic parents like to think that they're different and they would like their children to receive something better, so they talk about saints, but nothing that they pursue in their life resembles that which the saints pursued in their lives. And consequently, the children don't receive an education that looks anything like the education that the saints received when they were sent to schools to be educated by men, many of whom were living saints. The living saints who were the teachers gave the children education that would equip them to become living saints. They weren't sent to schools to be taught by peasants who talked about learning. They were sent to study with wise men, to learn the culture and discipline of the life of wise men. St. Thomas Aquinas was educated in a Benedictine monastery. He learned the discipline of the Christian life from the men around him who were living that life. And this is why standards are so low in modern schools. It has nothing to do with the children's ability. As I said, I'm working with young children, and there's no difference. I have teenage students who can barely get anything done. I have young children who make great progress in classical studies. I have children who are 10 years old who are ahead of children who are 18 years old in many courses. It has nothing to do with age. It has everything to do with culture. Nothing to do with age. Everything to do with culture. The students who seek these things are excited to meet with me because they know that I seek these things. The students who are being raised like peasants, they have no interest at all in talking to me. To them, I'm a weirdo, because the life of study and learning is simply not on their radar. It's pointless. It makes no sense. How does this lead to food? How does this lead to pleasure? How does this lead to fame or popularity or possessions? How does this stuff, quote unquote, help me in real life? And the problem is that their idea of real life is not real life. This is why educational standards are so low today. It's not the fault of schools. It's not the fault of children. It's not the fault of nature. It's ultimately the fault of parents. Their undisciplined life, their culture, their neglect of studies sets the bar so low for their children. And when it comes time to need to push them and motivate them and stir them up to work hard and study, the parents can't provide that support because they have no taste for it themselves. And so many of them just spend their time yelling at their children as if something's wrong with the children because the children want the same things that the parents want. And they get frustrated as if the children are letting the parents down rather than what's really happening, which is that the parents are letting the children down. And I can demonstrate this in the families that I work with. There are families who signed up for tutoring who have already quit. As soon as the task lists were provided, as soon as the children started falling behind and they found themselves accountable to weekly meetings that are going to check to see if even a single task was completed over the course of a week, they had no interest in that discipline. They were hoping that they could throw a little bit of money at me and that I would somehow magically take over their child's life and cause their child to have the mind of a wise man while he lived the life of a peasant. And as soon as they realized that I had no interest in doing that, their interest in classical education suddenly disappeared. And within weeks, they had given up their tutoring spot and disappeared. It's no mystery. I can see it coming. I can tell you exactly who it will be. Because if the parents aren't seeking what they tell their children that the children need to seek, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because this work of study is difficult. This work is sacrificial. It's difficult. It's exhausting. It's constant. And if the parents aren't there to support and help and encourage and challenge their children by their own example, there's just no chance. There's no chance. It's not going to happen. The parents who are engaged have children who get work done and who engage. The parents who don't engage have children waiting for their chance to be adults so they don't have to engage. And that's how education works. Now, I'm not saying that diligent parents who are engaged in pursuing saintly lives raise saints. That's not what I'm saying. The spiritual life is entirely dependent upon grace. The theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity are infused in the soul by God. They have nothing to do with education. We can lead our children through proper education to be rightly disposed to faith, hope, and charity, but we cannot impart to their souls faith, hope, and charity by any education. So I'm not saying that parents who seek to live like saints will have children who necessarily live like saints. That's explicitly contradicted by the first chapter of the Gospel of St. John, which says, "To as many as received him, Christ gave to them power to become sons of God, to those who believed in his name, who were born not from human bloods or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but who are born of God." That life of grace is not in the power of parents, but habits of life, academic activity. These things are in the influence of parents. My own children, for example, they may not pursue the spiritual studies with as much interest or zeal or appreciation as I do, but they're still excellent students. My son Jonathan is on ROTC scholarship in college, getting good grades. My daughter Elizabeth is a 4.0 student in college, getting good grades. They learn to study by living in a family that studies. I can't infuse theological virtues into their souls. They have to seek these things themselves by their own free will. But the habits and the disciplines of life, the things we talk about at the table, the things we talk about in our time together, those things are in my control. And that's the difference. I'm talking about academic work. I'm not talking about spiritual life and grace and bearing the fruits of the Holy Spirit. That's between an individual soul and God. I'm talking about habits of life that are established and maintained by parents in the lives of their children. This is the essential need for children to thrive academically. They have to have parents who live academically, who are studying and thinking and talking about important subjects, studying authoritative sources of classical and Catholic knowledge. The children should be able to name the authors their parents talk about all the time. Who do mom and dad talk about all the time? What books do mom and dad read? What authors do mom and dad read? If their answers are Taylor Marshall and Michael Voris and Jordan Peterson and whoever the other pop stars of YouTube are this month, then the situation is revealed. That's not what Catholic studies would look like. If they say sacred scripture, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Liturgy of the Hours, the writings of St. Augustine, the Summa Theologica, now we're talking about Catholics who are studying the sources of Catholic faith and scholastic philosophy. If your children were asked, what do mommy and daddy study? What authors do mommy and daddy read? What topics do mommy and daddy talk about? What would their answers be? That's the truth. That's the truth. And we have to work to make those answers be the right answers. We have to work so that if someone did ask our children, what books do mommy and daddy study, they would give the names of the right books, sacred scripture, the catechism, and so on. What topics do mommy and daddy talk about? They should be the topics that the saints wrote books about. They should be the topics that the sacred scriptures teach about. They should be the topics that the catechism is arranged to address. These things are in our control, and our children know them. And if we were to ask these questions, the answers that we got from our children would reveal everything. The difference between a well-parented child and a poorly parented child is that if the child goes into sin or falls away from the faith, the child will answer questions that prove that they've been well taught. The child will say things like, I already know what you think about this, but, and then talk about the bad decision. It's not a mystery to know when the parents have done their job. But what we see in the lives of most children is parents not doing their job. And again, I'm not saying that all children should be educated like the children of noblemen and children in monasteries in the medieval age. I'm not saying that. I don't believe that for 1 second. I expect that the number of children who are going to study real classical Catholic studies is going to be very small. That's why when people tell me what I need to do to change the Classical Liberal Arts Academy to get more students, I ignore them because I'm not looking for numbers of students. I'm looking for a quality of student. And that quality of student has to do with quality of parental household culture. And I know that it's very rare. I'm not stupid. I know it's very rare. And that's what I'm seeking. That's why you won't see the Academy running ads like tan books trying to sell homeschool programs. It's all just dumbed down grade level stuff. That's not what we're interested in. I'm not looking at the mass market. I'm not looking to sell as many as possible and to enroll as many as possible. There has to be a certain level of commitment and quality of culture, or it's just a waste of time. We're just dressing up peasants in school uniforms and pretending that we're interested in something that we're not interested in. The parents have to lead, and imitating Christ, say to their children, come, follow me. That parents don't do that today is why standards in schools are so low. You can't tell a child what he needs to go do and how important it is while you completely neglect it. The children will not fall for that. Now, there are many other obstacles. But I think that most of the other obstacles can be overcome. But this obstacle, I don't believe, is ever overcome, unless a student takes initiative as an adult when they become free from the influence of their parents, separate from the culture of their household, establish their own space, and pursue this culture themselves. That's what I had to do, for example. So even if a child is plagued by an undisciplined and distracted family life, all hope is not lost, and they can't use their childhood as an excuse once they reach adulthood and they're free to go establish their own life and culture. So there's never a time where there's no hope for success in studies. But as far as progressing in these studies in childhood, which is ideal, it's only possible if the parents are seeking this goal themselves and have the personal discipline and focus to seek it and seek it with their children. The lack of this and the hypocrisy among parents in modern society is why educational standards are so low. When parents are watching R-rated movies and telling their children they can't watch them because there's bad stuff in those movies, it's no surprise that the kids become disinterested in the G movies. And the same thing that parents do with entertainment and culture, they do with education and spiritual life. And that's why educational standards are so low. And the solution, thank God, is very simple. Parents have to get their act together and reorient their lives. Seek wisdom. Seek the way of perfection like Jesus taught us, and say to their children, hey kids, come on, let's go and do this together.